Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Minnesota Zoo's speaker series. We're really happy to have you here tonight, and I hope you got to enjoy our adult night out as well. My name is Tara Harris, and I'm the Vice President for Conservation here at the Minnesota Zoo. And I'd like to take this opportunity now to thank the Minnesota's Clean Water, Land, and Legacy Amendment for making this event free this evening. We'd also like to thank our media sponsor for this series, MinPost. So please be sure to check out their Earth Journal blog, which covers environmental issues in the news, with a special emphasis on solutions to environmental challenges. So this evening, to allow for wider access for our presentation, we're offering live captioning with an emphasis on live. So our captioner is typing as I speak, having no idea what is going to be said next. I'm not going to pull any jokes on her back there, but we just ask in advance for your understanding when you might see words on the screen that are incorrect. Now, I'd like to introduce our speaker for this evening, Dr. Dan Caraveau. Dan is an assistant professor at the Bee Research Lab in the Department of Entomology at the University of Minnesota. His research is focused on understanding the ecological factors shaping wild bee communities and how wild bee communities influence pollination of crops and native plants. Dan earned his bachelor's degree in wildlife biology at the University of Montana and his PhD in ecology at Colorado State University. He then conducted postdoctoral work on crop pollination and habitat restoration at Rutgers University. In his work, he is interested in understanding fundamental questions in ecology while also generating solutions for better conservation and management of wild native bees. So please join me in welcoming Dan to the stage.
All right, well, thanks for the invite and thanks everyone for coming. It's fantastic to be here. I feel like I'm one of the animals in the display here. This is a really neat place. So I'm really excited to talk to you guys tonight. As Tara said, I'm assistant professor at the University of Minnesota at the Bee Lab. We just got a new bee building built. I've been here just a year and a half, and I study wild bee ecology. But I'm going to speak in a more general, not really about my research, but I want to really get into talking about wild bees. And one of my goals here is that after seeing all these really cool animals, that you leave here thinking that bees are maybe one of the most interesting groups of animals, even though you've been looking at a lot of other things. So I'm going to kind of compete with these things for a bit. But, to start us off, what I want to do is situate bees within animals, within insects. So bees are part of, we usually break down insects generally into orders, and bees are part of the order of Hymenoptera. That's the membrane-winged insects. And it includes a lot of really interesting things. It includes things like ants, which you see here. This is actually a South American soldier ant. It includes wasps. So this is a Polistes wasp, or there's a lot of hunting wasps. But this is a huge order of insects. In fact, there's about 180 to 190,000 described species in this order. So to give you an idea of how many birds there are on Earth, there's about 10,000 birds and just over 5,000 mammals, and this has 190,000, right? So really diverse group. And in addition to having like ants and wasps that everyone's familiar with, they also have these crazy parasitoids. So this is actually the smallest flying insect on Earth. It's the kikihuna from Hawaii, and it's about 0.15 millimeters. And it's a parasitic wasp. Some of these wasps, there's many parasitic wasps. They do things like control brains, turn things into zombies, all sorts of really neat stuff. But that's not what the focus of the talk is today. The focus of the talk, invite me back to that next one, is it's coming? These are the wild bees, which is the group of insects that I really focus on. And one way to think of wild bees are, in fact, they're just vegetarian wasps, in a sense. But they're an incredibly diverse group of organisms. So when we think of bees, everyone kind of thinks of the honeybee, which is a fascinating insect, but not the focus of my work. And that's one species that really has come from Eurasia. There's 20,000 other species, at least 20,000 other species of bees on Earth. So they're a really diverse, interesting group of insects. So what I want to start us off with, in speaking about bees, is a little bit about the brief history of bees. Where do they come from? Or when did they arise? So we don't have a lot of great fossils of bees. Of course, they don't have bones, they're not big, they don't fossilize very well. So the way we've got kind of ideas on ancient bees is by looking at amber. So bees will visit tree resins and they'll collect that resin and they get caught in that, just kind of like Jurassic Park, but this is for bees. And and there's been some really nice fossils found. So this is a fossil here, and you can kind of see the bee. This is the compound eye right here. This is the antenna. And then this is what's called a corbicula, and I'll talk about that in a second. This was found in New Jersey, so this is some amber from New Jersey. And it's the oldest, best fossil we have of a bee. And that corbicula, I mentioned that corbicula, this is the only picture of a honeybee, by the way. The corbicula is right here. That's this area that's only some bees use to capture their pollen. Okay, so we can get these really nice features in this fossil, so we know it's a bee. And this is the name. It's a Cretotrigona prisca. I might use some Latin names in here tonight, which is going to be a lot of fun for the person typing. But as entomologists, we don't even really have common names, so I apologize, but I'll try to not do too much. Anyways, but Cretotrigona prisca is very interesting. The name is very interesting. We use these names for a reason, actually. So prisca, to start out, is the species name, and that simply means ancient. So this is an old thing. That makes sense. But then the other thing is interesting too. Creto stands for Cretaceous. So this bee was flying around about 65 to 75 million years ago. So if you would have seen this bee, you might have also seen a T-Rex, for example. This bee wouldn't have looked very different from some of the other bees that we have, but the T-Rex would look different from what we have today. But Trigona is actually a really interesting one. And what that is that's a group of what I call these corbiculates. So it's the bees that have that packaged pollen on their legs, and they're social. And what's interesting about that is those are very highly derived bees. They evolved much later. So we know that bees have been around for a lot longer than that oldest fossil. So that's really been clear. So to really get at that, Sophie Cardinal and Brian Danforth out of Cornell did some really nice work. And what they ended up doing is they looked at a bunch of different bee species that were found in fossils. Excuse me, they looked at a bunch of species that were around today, and they basically looked at their DNA, and there are these regions in the DNA that kind of change really almost in a clock-like manner. And if you do that for a bunch of different bees, and you kind of know where they exist within this big family tree, you can get an idea of how old a group is, when it first arose. And so through this, basically this molecular clock type of approach, they've figured out that bees probably first appeared on the scene about 123 million years ago. So they've been around for quite a long time. Now, in addition to that number just being something kind of interesting, what else is kind of cool about that is something else was going on at that period in Earth's history as well. And that's this. That's the explosion of flowering plants. So right about the time that bees really started to diversify and evolve very quickly, we also had a very rapid diversification of flowers. And most of the flowers you knew today started really arising at this time. These are what's called the eudicots. So a group of when you think of a flower, it's probably a eudicot. So we don't really know yet if bees were part of the reason for this diversification, or if they simply went along for the ride and diversified along with the flowers. That's still an area of debate. But what's interesting and a thing to know is bees and flowers have been locked together since the very beginning. Okay, so they're very tightly linked, and it's been that way since they've been around, 123 million or more years. Another thing I want to note is that I mentioned there's 20,000 different species, and we're discovering, this isn't the work that I do, but colleagues of mine are working and discovering new species all the time. And I want to really highlight some of the work and some of the things I'm going to show to you are based on collections data. So we do a lot of work where we go out and we collect bees, and we do kill them and we put them on pins, and it's really important work for us to do because we can't identify things out in the field. In addition to that, their populations, for the most part, even some of the rare ones, might be fairly, not really low. They're not in the numbers like we have like Asian horses and 500 individuals or something like that. But habitat can have really big effects and wipe out lots of individuals. but for collections, it's a really valuable part of what we do. And in fact, a lot of these collections are incredibly valuable, and the reason is we can look back in time. So people were collecting bees, 100 years ago. We have some bees that Alfred Russel Wallace collected in some collections, things like that, like 100 and so plus years. So we can look back in time at some of these things. And in addition to that, there are tons of bees sitting in collections that are just waiting to be identified, and new species are to be found. And so if I was to tell a young person going into science and their goal was to discover new species of an animal, I would say go to an insect museum and look at them a lot, and you're going to discover new species. So as an example of that, a colleague of mine, Jason Gibbs, he works on a special, just one subgenus of bee, and this genus is called Lasioglossum. How did you guys spell that one? No. Okay. Perfect. Okay. And, so this is the work that she does. Jason, she does great work, obviously. Jason works on this, this one genus of bee, and he was looking at a bunch of bees in the American Museum of Natural History, and he discovered this bee, and he found it in New York City. It had been collected all over New York City, and it's a new species, and it had never been looked at enough, but it was sitting in a collection. And Jason always has these great names for things. So the genus, again, is Lasioglossum, and then the species name is Gotham. So Lasioglossum Gotham. He also has another one my favorite is the genus, again, Lasioglossum, and then the species is awesome. So Lasioglossum is awesome. It's fun being an entomologist. Okay, so I'm going to walk through a little bit of some of the bee families, talk a little bit about some of the diversity that is out there. So it's widely recognized that there are 7 different families of bees, so I want to walk through these different families with you. The first one I'll kind of get off the table quick is the Stenotrinidae. It's a very interesting group, but it's a very tiny group. It's about 21 species, so about 0.1% of bees on Earth are this one family of bees. There are none in Minnesota. All of them are in Australia, and they're all totally solitary species. I only see them in Australia, so I've never seen one of these live. I hope to one day. The second group is the second one I'll talk about is the Mellididae. Now this is probably my favorite family. They're not very diverse either. There's about 187 species of Mellididae, although some new ones were just discovered. And there's about 200 species. About four species we have here in the state of Minnesota, so not real diverse. They're really the most abundant and most diverse in Africa. And what's neat about this bee is that, for one, is that we think this is the basal group of bees. We think this is the earliest bees were like the Mellididae. And they're often very highly specialized on particular flowers. So that's really interesting. We have things like this Redivivia bee. This is from South Africa. And you can see her front legs there. What she does is she goes into an orchid with a very long corolla, very long flower, and she basically just takes in all this oil that the orchid has and just douses her legs with oil, this floral oil. And she brings it back to her nest, and her larvae end up eating that oil. They're very specialized on a few of these orchids. And then what's neat about this group as well is the orchids have also figured out ways to deal with this pollination. So this is the same bee, this Redivivia bee, and all those flowers around there are different species of orchid from South Africa. And she visits these different flowers. They're all in the same genus. But what's neat about it is that the flowers might compete if they put pollen all in the same place in the bee, right? So the bee's going to move pollen from one flower to another, and if she visits this species and gets a bunch of pollen here, and then also the species B gets a bunch of pollen on her body at the same place, that plant might compete. So these plants have evolved to place pollen on different places on her body. So you can tell the plant species she visited by where that pollen is located on the body. Pretty wild. Really interesting. We actually have some really cool, great mellidids here in Minnesota. This is Macropus nuda, and this is a Mellididae. It's in the Mellididae family as well, and it's a specialist, and it's an oil collecting bee as well on this yellow loosestrife, Lismachia. And so it's very rare, but you can see it at the Eloise Butler wildflower area here in the Twin Cities. So this is one of the places we have actually seen this bee. And it's a really unique, really highly specialized, really cool individual. Okay, so let's move on to the bigger groups, the more speciose groups. So first of all, I want to start off with the Apidae. This is about 5,700 different species. We have about 100 or so in Minnesota. They're really abundant bee globally. You'll find them pretty much everywhere except for Antarctica. And this is what people think about when they think of bees. So these are the honeybees, the bumblebees. There's a whole bunch of other species as well. But nonetheless, this is what people normally think about. These are often floral generalists, so they'll visit lots and lots of different flowers. Next in abundance is we have what's called the Megakylidae. So there's about 4,100 species of megakylids. And these are also really abundant globally. They'll visit lots of different flowers. And what's really neat is they're floral generalists, but they line their nests with this vegetation. So they take these leaves you see here, and they line their nests, which are usually in holes in wood, and they line it with different vegetation. This is a really beautiful one. This is a bee from Turkey that was found recently. And what they do is they actually visit different flower petals, and they make their nests out of these flower petals. So they have these really beautiful, beautiful nests. But we have bees in Minnesota. They don't use flower petals, but they use some of these leaves. And then the other way to tell the megakylids, which is really neat, is they have this area here. You see those hairs? Those are called scopy. And those scopy, what they are used to do is they gather pollen. So what the female does is she places all of this pollen on her belly. So we call these the hairy belly bees, because that's where they place all their pollen. So you can always tell where they have their pollen. And also, this is also a really neat bee, because this group has has the largest bee ever recorded. This is called Megakylie Pluto. So this is a bee that was first discovered by Alfred Russel Wallace in, I think it was around the 1858, somewhere around there, in Indonesia. So for those of you who don't know, Alfred Russel Wallace basically figured out evolution by natural selection at the same time Darwin did. And he is an amazing person to read his life and his stories. But he found this bee. It's the biggest bee. It's about 4 or 5 centimeters in length. I got to hold one on a pin, of course, at the Cornell collection. And it hadn't been found from 1858, and it wasn't found again until 1981. So it was just recently discovered again. It hadn't been seen since then. They have these really big mandibles, these big jaws, which you see here. And what they do is they go into termite nests, and they burrow into termite nests and make their nests in these termite nests, and they line their nests with a bunch of resin. So they're the biggest bee on Earth. Okay, so those are the megakylids. We also have the andrenids, about 2,900 species of andrenids. About 95 in Minnesota. We actually have a really pretty high diversity of andrenids in Minnesota. These are really abundant in the Western Hemisphere. They're totally solitary. And this group will have a lot of floral specialists. And this one and the next one you also might be seeing a lot of. They're very common often in the springtime. So these are some of our spring bees. Next is the Calididae. And these are called the Cellophane Bees. So they will line their nests with cellophane. There's about 2,400 species. Really diverse in Australia. They're often solitary, but they'll nest in these aggregations. So sometimes if you're in your yard, if you have a big bare patch of soil, you might see a bunch of bees nesting, especially early in the spring. They're not social. They're not actually, they're not workers and queens. It's just one individual that's solitary that's doing it. But they nest kind of all together, kind of like we do in a neighborhood. And they range again from generalists and specialists. And then the final group to talk about are these really beautiful Halictidae. And we have these, this is the species we have in Minnesota. Again, quite diverse in Minnesota. They're really abundant. These beautiful green bees, you'll see them in your yard, even if you live in downtown Minneapolis, and we do have a yard. They have a huge diversity of life histories. They can be social, solitary, parasitic, and they can visit lots of different plants and be quite generalized. So now what I want to do now is talk a little bit about some of the biology of bees. So we talked about this great diversity, but let's talk a little bit about some of their life history. Well, for one of which is that bees, all bees really use, they all have nests. So unlike things like butterflies that might kind of just fly around and lay their egg here or there, bees actually have individual nests. Most bees will nest in the ground, and what they'll do is a female, it's always the female doing all the work in bees, what she'll do is she'll go out and she'll leave the nest and she'll gather a bunch of pollen, and then what she'll do is, as I said, most of them are ground nesters, she'll come back in, this is her whole little hole here, she'll come down and she'll make this pollen ball. This is a ball of pollen that the female has made there. And then what she does is she'll lay a little egg on that pollen ball, she'll seal up that cell, and then that's a larvae that will develop just like you would have like a caterpillar, and then it'll turn into an adult and hatch. And you can actually see her here digging. This is digging in the ground here. So all these are her offspring here, and that's her there. So a lot of bees, really, most bees, we think about 70% or so would nest in the ground. But some will also nest in twigs as well. They'll nest in cavities or in twigs. We actually have some work going on at the bee lab right now where we're studying which species of dead plant stems do these bees like. So they'll nest in here and they'll bring a bunch of pollen, which you see here, and then they lay their egg, and then they make a wall. These are all from one individual bee. And we're doing some work to figure out, which stems are best for bees. So we're trying to, if people want to have a lot of bees, these sorts of bees in their yard, they might want to leave some of their dead stems up over the winter. So there's always some bees that nest here. In addition to that, bees can range from being social. So we think of the honeybee, which is an incredibly interesting social organism that has all these different jobs and really complex behaviors. But most bees, in fact, about 85% of bees are totally solitary. There's no queen. The female does all the raising of the offspring. She doesn't have any help at all. So about 85% of bees are in fact solitary. And in fact, social bees that we have, the big ones, we have a couple, but bumblebees are a really good example of the social bees that we end up having here in Minnesota. And sociality is pretty interesting, and it really can allow bees to nest almost in some pretty unique places. This is a neat bee called Apis dorsata. This is the giant honeybee. This is found in Nepal and in Asia. It's about twice the size of a regular honeybee, and they're incredibly aggressive, so they just nest wherever they want, right? Nobody really bothers them. And they're supposedly even more aggressive than some of the Africanized bees that we have here in South America. So they just kind of nest anywhere. But what's really cool, there's a bunch of honey hunters out of this area, like in the Himalayas and whatnot, where they basically will climb these ladders, which you see this man here, and it's part of their religion that they can't have any metal on the ladders because they think that will disturb the bees, and it's a spiritual thing. And so they go and they take what you see here. These are combs. These are combs of these giant, really aggressive honeybees. And they take all this smoke, they make all these fires, so the bees are kind of disoriented, and then they go and they collect these different combs full of honey from the honeybees. So this is a really kind of unique species. But we, of course, here we have the bumblebee. And I also want to say before I move on is that most bees actually don't produce honey at all. So only the honeybees do. There's about 9 species or so of honeybees that make honey. For the most part, none of the other 20,000 species are actually honey producers. And that includes even the social bumblebee. So the bumblebees are totally social, and you might be seeing some of them right now. And so they have a really interesting life cycle. So what they do is they come out, the queens, they come out in the early spring. They've already been mated from the late summer or fall of last year. So what you'll see now is you'll see these really big queens, really big bumblebees flying around. And they can be really easy to see because there's not a lot of vegetation. And what they'll do is they'll kind of fly around and they'll hover above the ground like this for a while. And you can just kind of watch them. They're totally docile. And then all of a sudden they'll just get up and just fly away really fast. And so what they're doing right now is they're mating. They've already mated, but they're looking to start their nest again for this year. So you're going to be seeing a lot of these queens. And they start doing a lot of their foraging, and they start making their nests. So they're just starting to build their nest. There's no bumblebee workers out yet. But she's starting to raise her daughters, and her daughters will become these workers in the summer. And then in the late summer, the bumblebees are going to fly around, and they're going to mate with different males, and then they'll go into what's called a hibernaculum. So what this is a little area in the ground. They just dig a little hole. Basically, we know virtually nothing about the biology at this point. But what they do is they dig a little hole in the ground. All of their workers die. All of their daughters die. So the hive totally dies. But the queen, some of the new queens survive. So these are new queens now. And they've already mated with males. And they just hang out there all winter. And then they pop up again right about now. So that's another big difference. All the social bees, and in fact all the social wasps that we have, especially like things like yellow jackets that sting you, right, that people always get annoyed by in late summer, their colonies always die every year, and then they get built back up, and they get their biggest in the fall, and then they die, and they go back again. So that's what happens up here in the temperate zone. Honeybees, in contrast, honeybees will actually, the reason they have all that honey production is because they need to survive the winter. So those colonies are like a perennial plant, and they'll stick around, and they just build up tons of honey reserves. And we've used that actually to get honey, of course. Okay, so one of the most, in addition to, so there's a social lifestyle, there's a solitary lifestyle, but another lifestyle that's very common, and I just briefly mentioned it earlier, is a parasitic lifestyle. And there's actually more parasitic bees than there are social bees species. So it's a more diverse group of parasites. And there are parasites kind of in a number of those different families. And what I mean by parasites, most parasites are what we call Klepto Parasites. So what they do is this is a nomada, and it looks like kind of like a wasp. It's really pretty, they're pretty heavily armored. So what they'll do is they'll find a bee's nest. They're usually pretty specialized on other bee species. And they'll go into their nest, and they'll go into that pollen ball that you saw, and they'll lay their egg on top of the egg of the host species. Their eggs, of these guys, of these gals, hatch very, very quickly, and they have big jaws, and they kill the host baby, and then they eat all the pollen of that species. So they're totally, these species, the females, unlike other females, they don't collect pollen for their young. They use the pollen from others. It's actually a very interesting group of bees, all these different parasitic bees, and they're not bees that are having an effect on the population of anything that we're worried about. In fact, if we have a community with a lot of parasites, we know it's a really healthy bee community. They're actually very interesting. And so they're not having, they've evolved with all of these bees and not having a huge effect. So those are the kleptoparasites, but one of the neatest group, others, is what are called the social parasites. So this is Bombas Athis. And what they do is, these are types of bumblebees, and they will go into the nest of other bees, and they'll kill the queen, usually kill the queen. And then what they do is they don't make any workers, they just make all those workers from the nest of the queen they killed, they make them into her slaves. So she does all the foraging, she feeds, those workers feed all of her offspring. So she basically is totally doing a social parasitic thing where she's killing the queen and using the hive to produce her own young. So it's a really interesting kind of system. And again, one that isn't having an effect on the species, but is a really kind of neat biology. All right. But the thing that unites all of these bees, the thing that's the one thing that is everything, is that these bees use floral resources for their entire life cycle. So as larvae, they use pollen and nectar, and as adults, they use pollen and nectar. So all those 20,000 bees, well, except for there's 3 bees species in Panama that eat dead things, but we don't talk about those. No, they're interesting. But most bees really all use flowers for their offspring. So again, it's coming back to the idea, bees and flowers have evolved together from the beginning, and they're still really, really tightly linked. And all of these structures, they just have a ton of really cool structures that allow them to do that. So this is a scanning electron microscope picture of a bee hair, and that's a pollen grain on the hair. And you can see how the hairs are branched. And actually, sometimes it's really difficult to determine if it's a bee or a wasp, if you don't know what you're looking at. But if you have a microscope and you can look and see branched hairs, you know it's a bee. And all these branched hairs, these evolved to help bees better carry that pollen. So they really have this morphology very early on. And they're really good at what they do. So this is a halictus bee with a ton of pollen on her. They're basically flying dust mops. I mean, they just go to a flower and they just get a ton of pollen on their bodies. So they're really, really effective at what they do. And because of that, they are really great in, really important in a lot of different, for us, right? So about a third of the crops, about a third of the food that we eat is pollinated by an animal. It uses animal pollination to produce usually the fruit. And a lot of that, a third is kind of maybe a lower number in the sense that there's things like corn and wheat and rice that is not pollinated. But many of the really nutritious crops, the blueberries, the nuts, the cranberries, those are all, a lot of those are animal pollinated. Coffee, often is a very important crop. And they're also really critical, and bees are really big pollinators of most of those crops. And in addition to that, about 87% or so of flowering plants rely on animals to transfer their pollen at some point in their life cycle, the plants do. So a lot of native plants are really dependent on pollinators, and bees are the big pollinators in a lot of these systems as well. There's other important pollinators as well, and we can talk about pollination in another talk, but bees are really, we think of as a big one. So let's move on then to the next part here. It's this question here, are wild bees declining? This is a question I obviously get a lot, and it's things we hear a lot in the news. And it's kind of, and it's a tricky question in a sense, because it's kind of like asking, are birds declining? Or are plants declining? There's a lot of different species of bees, right? So there's 20,000 different species of bees. So you really have to think about what you're talking about. But what do we know about this? Well, a couple things we know is that bees are really dependent upon habitat that has a lot of great floral resources. So if we convert too much land into agriculture, if we don't leave a lot of habitat for bees, a lot of the work that I've done has shown that these bees will actually decline in number, especially at least in a local sense. So we know that habitat's really important. We know that a lot of overuse of pesticides and incorrect use of pesticides can have big effects and decrease bee populations and other populations of a number of insects as well. And then we also know that a lot of diseases can also have important impacts. So we've seen all of these three things have been demonstrated to really show declines in the diversity and abundance of bees. But one of the key things that we're trying to understand is, one of the things we don't know is we don't know a lot. There's a lot of really highly rare species of bees. Okay, so this bee here is called Turkish dorsalis, and this bee here is Nomata rhodeci. This bee is a bee that we collected in New Jersey and hadn't been collected since 1910, and we found about 8 of them. The reason it's not been seen is it's really highly dependent upon this one plant called strophostyles. And so we don't know much about it. It's rare, but we don't know much about its biology. So we don't know if it's increasing or decreasing. Another one is this Nomata rhodeci, which is a specialist on a specialist. So again, we don't have the data to say whether it's declining or not, but it's a really highly rare bee. But this species actually be found in cranberry farms, and pretty conventional cranberry farms. And some of these things are incredibly rare. So this is the Microscope that Melita I talked about earlier with the oil collecting bee, and this is the one that we have here in Minnesota at Eloise Butler. So it's not very common, and it has a parasite, this parasite Epiloides pilosolus. It's thought to be the rarest bee in North America. It's only been seen, I think it's like 4 or 5 different times. Never been recorded in Minnesota, but I bet it's actually in Minneapolis. Like I would guess it's there if Microscope Muta is there. We just haven't seen it yet. So there's a lot of things we don't really know with some of these species. But some of them, and some bees are actually doing okay. So this is a Bombas impatiens. This is the common eastern bumblebee. It's very abundant. You can find it in, as I said, anywhere in town here, or it goes all the way to the East Coast. It's in New York City on the Highline Trail, which I've seen it. We think they're doing pretty well. We think this species is actually doing quite fine. But what's tricky is we don't really know much about how species have done over time. And the reason is we don't have good population estimates because we don't have people haven't been collecting data in that way. If you think of how, like the government collects census data, they have a certain way of figuring out how many people there are. We don't have that for insects. So we really have no idea how many insects there were in the past in a lot of these cases. And so the one way we can kind of get at that is, again, coming back to this these collections and going back and see what have people collected in the past. What are the records that have been going on through time? And so because, as I mentioned, we had collections all the way from more than 100 years ago, we can start to do this. We're going to actually start to look at some of this in Minnesota. Our insect collection is 135 years old, and there's about 4 million specimens in the collection. Not of bees, that's of everything else, but it's one of these regionally one of the really important collections around. But by using these collections, we can actually start to ask really interesting questions. And one of the things we've noticed is that some species have declined really dramatically by looking at some of these collections. And some of these groups, I'm going to talk about a couple here. One of which is this is a group Hylaeus. These are called Cellophane Bees. These are in Hawaii, and they've had some pretty dramatic declines. And this is an interesting group of bees. This is actually the first group of bees that were listed as endangered. So in October of 2016, these groups of 7 species of this genus Hylaeus in Hawaii were listed as endangered species. Hawaii only has 63 native bee species, and they're all of this one genus. So this was the first bee that was listed. We know that other species have really declined as well. This is a bee called Bombas Curricula, and it's a bee that we have here in Minnesota. It's actually this stippled area is the range of Bombas Curricula, but it's been really declining quite rapidly. And so if we look at old collections, and we see that they used to collect a pretty decent amount of Bombas Curricula, and now they collect. We don't find them hardly at all. So the decline has been pretty rapid. And then the biggest one that we've really seen, and this again comes from this collection data, is this species here, which is Bombas Athis. It's also called the rusty patch bumblebee, and this is the one that has been in the news a lot lately. So this bee was just recently, I think just in January 10th, listed as an endangered species. So it actually just got on the endangered species list pretty recently. And this species, its range was all kind of throughout the east. We see here North Dakota, South Dakota is kind of the western edge of its range, but it's all in this area here. And just to give you an idea of the decline of this species, I studied native bees in cranberry farms in New Jersey. And the work that I relied on to build my study was done in 1995, not very long ago. And in that study, they used Bombas Athis for sample size. There were so many of them that they wanted to use them to get some idea of pollination, and they could use that. It's gone. They haven't seen a Bombas Athis east of Mississippi for at least 10 years, except for one in Virginia, but has never been seen since. So it's just almost basically gone. It was a really abundant, fairly abundant bee even here in the Twin Cities, and it's just dropped really, really rapidly. And we don't really know why. The best evidence suggests is that there was a disease that came in, maybe from Europe, maybe not, but a disease emerged, and we think that's really one of the main drivers of this, in addition to potentially loss of habitat. But what's also really interesting about this bee, and really unique for us here in the Twin Cities, is that, I'll come back to that in a second, is last year, in 2016, this is called Bumblebee Watch. This is a site that's done by Saracen Society, and some of us do species identification for this site. What they do is they basically get citizen scientists will take pictures of bees, and they'll send them in and show their sightings, and people will look through them and see what they are. And one of the things that's happened with this is that last year there was 26 different sightings. This includes a lot of scientists who are working and surveying bees. And in those 26, 13, half of those were in the Twin Cities metro area. So we are in the hotspot for this species. So you can kind of see them. There's some places in Madison, and there's been some kind of scatterings other places. But in the Twin Cities, half of all the spottings is where it was seen. Now, I don't want to say this bee is an urban bee. The reason is that it's been seen a lot in the Twin Cities is because there's a lot of people in the Twin Cities looking. So it could be in other areas. But if you were in Virginia or in the east of the Appalachia or in Ohio and even near a big city, you'd not see this at all. So we do know it's declined almost everywhere, and it's declined a lot here too, but we actually have this species here. In fact, you can see them in a number of different places. We had one just outside the lab last summer. And so I think that's a really hopeful thing for us working on conservation, because I think we can actually affect change. We can actually do something because we actually have this species here. If you lived in New Jersey or if you lived in Ohio, you can't do anything because it's basically extinct there. But we do have them here in the Twin Cities. So what we do here in Twin Cities matters for the conservation of this endangered species. There's just a little zooming in on that. So what are some things, and people always ask this, what are some things you can do to help with bees and conservation? And a couple of things, one of which I think is a great thing, is you can become a scientist, you become a citizen scientist. There's a lot of great programs out there now where scientists are relying upon the general public to go out and take photographs or do observations, because we can't be out everywhere. We can't hire enough undergrads to go and just collect lots of data for us. So we need lots of eyes out there, and it's a great way to get involved and get to know a species or know a conservation issue, and you really get invested in it. So this again is the Bumblebee Watch. You can just Google this and find this, and we put on different identification things. So I think at the Minnesota Bee Lab, Elaine Evans does a lot of work doing bumblebee identification, so you can go out and actually collect data and send that back, and we can get more eyes out there and really see where this species is and learn a lot. So we need a lot more looking around. So this is one way to really get involved, and I think do good work, is to become a citizen scientist. And with this rare species, you can do that here in the Twin Cities and not have to travel that far. Again, plant native flowers that bloom from now, that start blooming now. Shrubs are really good to do that, and all the way into the fall. So really try to get a lot of high diversity and make sure so you're getting that, because bees are around all summer. Some bees will be around as adults, they might live for 2 weeks, or if they're like a bumblebee, they might live for the whole summer. So you want flowers that are around the whole time. And a really great organization is the Saracen Society. They're focused on invertebrate conservation, so they do work on bees, and they do work on things like butterflies and dragonflies and all sorts of really important critters. They do a lot of great citizen science work and a lot of important work, so you can support them. And Saracen Society and our lab also has a bunch of native plants that ideas for plantings that you can put in. Increased nesting sites. So this is a critical thing. So all these bees need nests. So how do you do that? Well, the big ways to do that is to become a really bad gardener and yard keeper, like me, and you have a lot of bare ground. So I do it for the bees, right? That's what I tell my neighbors. And so a lot of bees will like bare ground, and these bees are, they won't sting. They're not, going to be menaces or anything. Not like yellow jackets, right? Everyone always freaks out about yellow jackets, and they're mean, but these are not. Or you can also leave a lot of dead stems, another thing that maybe your meticulous gardener wouldn't do, but that can be really effective for bee nests as well. And then finally, really, reduce pesticide use. So use it, don't use it at all. I oftentimes don't think there's a reason necessarily to use it in your yard unless you really have something you need to do. But really try to reduce it. If you do use it only if you really end up needing it. And then finally, hopefully you're interested in bees now, and you're going to go and look something up more. I mean, this is a short talk. I can't keep on going. I could keep on going, but I'm not. They're going to cut me off. There's a couple really great books that I just want to highlight that people, because I always get these questions like what books to get. One of which is Sam Drogy's book. So those beautiful pictures of those bees, really close up of all those really interesting ones. Sam is an amazing bee biologist, another thing he has done is just taken all these beautiful pictures of bees under the microscope. And what also Sam does is he lets all his photographs for free. Anybody can take them and use them and do whatever they want with them. It's totally out there. He has a Flickr site that you can waste a ton of time at. And look at all these really interesting organisms. But he has a coffee table book. It's like $15 on Amazon. It's really good to just kind of look at all these neat bees. Heather Holm had just released a great book on bees and identification and native plant forage guide. Heather's a fantastic biologist. This is a really good book. My wife, who hates reading field guides. She's a biologist business. She just likes to read them. She said she read this cover to cover. So it's a great book, and it's really kind of centered on the upper Midwest. So if you're interested in getting a lot of plants and learning a lot more about the bees that are here, this is a fantastic book to buy. Also, $1 of every book goes to the Native Bee Lab. And then a really great book. I don't know these authors, but they did a really nice job. The Bees in Your Backyard is a fantastic book. It has a lot of detail, but not too much, and a lot of really great pictures. And just a wealth of information. I think you could probably get all these for about $45 total. So anyways, a bunch of really good books if you want to expand this. A lot of great photos that I got from people that have done a lot of this great work. Some of them are mine, but these folks as well. And with that, I want to thank you guys for your time tonight. Questions? Do you want to do a microphone, or do you want to?
Someone here had a question?
You mentioned about various species declining, but not all of them. How serious is it, and have we made progress, or is it too early to tell?
How serious is it? It depends on the species. So for Bombas Athis, Bombas Curricula, those two bumblebee species, it's serious because they've really dropped really quickly. And I don't think we've done anything yet to make any progress with those. But I will say there's been a really big public interest in getting in more habitat. It's a great thing too because people like to put flowers in the ground. In a way, it's a fairly non-controversial thing to do. And we know that does help bees quite a bit. We've seen increases at least at the local level, but from a species level, we haven't not sure yet. Yeah. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
What relationships do the bees in Minnesota have with other animals? It's like, are they food for some animals, or are they prey, or do they interact in any symbiotic way?
Yeah, good question. So the bees interact with other animals. For the most part, they're really critical because they pollinate a lot of native plants, right? So a number of native plants and a lot of the wildflowers, pretty much all the wildflowers that we have, not pretty much all, a lot of them, I don't know the exact numbers, but a lot of them depend upon bees for pollination. So that's a really key thing. They're important in ecosystems for plants, and plants are important for ecosystems. That's the clearest link. There are a number of different predators on bees, for sure. Birds will eat bees. If you ever go to flowers and you see the yellow flowers, there are these things called crab spiders. They're really cool. They're flat and they're yellow. They look like a flower, and they just sit all day and they wait like a crab until the bee comes and they grab it. There's some really cool flies, robber flies that will look exactly like a bumblebee, and they're like vicious predators. Like if they were half the size of a lion, we'd all be dead. But they'll look like bumblebees. And I remember one time I was out netting and I saw this bee. I thought it was a bee out of the corner of my eye, and I was like, that bumblebee's eating a honeybee. Oh no, it's a robber fly. So there's a number of different predators that will definitely eat bees as well. Yeah.
Other questions?
How did you get passionate about bees?
How could you not get passionate? No, I love how species interact. I love species interactions. And I read a book about pollination, and that's a whole other talk. There's so many interesting pollination things, like different types of things that plants do. There's like plants that mimic the sex pheromone. This is an adult man, right? So there's the plants that mimic the sex pheromone of a wasp. And the male wasp will go and mate with that flower, and they'll prefer the flower to the female because that scent is so intense, right? So there's just like endless stories of that sort of stuff. And then pollination is also really cool because it really intersects. There's all those wonderful stories, but then it's really important. And I think people get it, right? It's important for food production. It's important for native plants. And so it's this thing that has all these wonderful stories, and it has a really important conservation aspect as well. And so you mix that all together, and it's great. Yeah.
Other questions over here?
What about the little cute bee houses that people are building? Are they helpful?
Like where they put the holes in them. Yeah, the cute bee houses. Yeah, they're cute and they're good. We have them actually at the bee lab a bit. So these are these are places where they're called bee hotels, and people will drill holes in them, and you'll get bees in them. And I think it's great as an education thing. And I think I think it's great because you'll end up seeing a lot of bees. It might be that they attract a lot of parasites, and so they might not be hugely benefiting on a population level. So, but we haven't done enough studies to really figure that out. Yeah.
Hi. Are you collaborating with the U of M vet school at all on bee diseases?
No, not in the vet school, and I don't know what work the vet school is doing. My colleague Marla Spivak, she kind of covers the honeybee angle of things, and she does a lot of honeybee disease issues. So she looks a lot at how honeybees have a kind of a social medicine system where it's very complicated, interesting stuff, and they're working a lot on the bee diseases. Native bees, it's harder to do some of the disease work. We are collaborating on some disease work. What's tricky with them is that you don't have them in a hive often, and so you might find them there, but you don't. It's hard to tell what are the symptoms. It's tricky to really determine to work with bees and disease in the wild bees in particular. So, yeah.
Do a lot of these bee studies come mostly from North America, or is it a globally kind of recognized trend?
Great question. To most of these, this is a problem in science, in biology. So the question is, do most of these studies come from North America? And the answer to that actually is no, but it's Europe. It's northern, Europe has Europe's really does a lot of native bee work, and we actually do a lot here too. But this huge, important question is what's going on in the tropics. And this is actually an issue. I studied birds for a long time. A lot of our biology is based on where scientists live. And that's a problem. And that's potentially a really big problem in crop systems, because in a lot of places in developing countries in Africa and South America, a lot of farmers will put a lot of effort into a very small area of crops that have high pollination needs. And so I think one of the things we need to really do is develop programs to start to reach out and start to really work on the issues that they're having in a lot of these countries, because I think that's a major question. But just we need more tropical biologists for sure. Yeah.
I have a question, Dan.
Yes.
What about our lawns? So, should people be leaving the dandelions and clovers? Should we be mowing our lawns less? Does that help native bees?
I think you should mow your lawns less. I think you just get rid of your lawns. No, I think the dandelions and clover actually are great for bees. Bumblebees love clover. We have done a study in the Minneapolis parks, and I'm going to forget the number now. Something like 35 species of bees were found on white clover in Minneapolis parks. So they like it quite a bit. It's not native, but it grows really easily, and that might be the good thing to do. I don't mind dandelions and clover. It's up to you whether you guys want to do it or not. But I think it's good to have the lawn. We are working on. It's just really started. It's been a couple years now in development, but there's a project at the Bee Lab to develop native plants that you can actually put into lawns that you can mow as well. That can handle a lot of that mowing, and also be food for bees. Yeah.
With the honeybee population only being 9 species, how is their population?
So how's the honeybee population? So there's 9 species. Most of them are in Asia. The honeybee is really one of the most abundant animals on Earth. It's a really abundant animal. And one of the things we try to struggle with a bit is that honeybee, there's just billions upon billions of honeybees. And that's because people keep them. They're domestic. The problem with honeybees right now is that it's difficult. They're having disease and other sorts of problems that beekeepers have a really hard time keeping them healthy. And then when that happens, it takes a lot of money to maintain big beekeeping operations. So that's the big problem with the honeybees, is that there's enough of them, but it's becoming more and more expensive and difficult for them to keep them. Yeah. So the populations are kind of doing okay, but it's the expense and the disease issues of maintaining them.
So you mentioned habitat loss was one of the biggest reasons
Yep.
they're declining. Is there like a specific reason, like maybe increase in agricultural land or
Yeah.
Have you done any of that?
Yeah, there's lots of reasons, and it depends on, habitat loss is a pretty specific, it's globally probably the biggest thing, I mean, for loss of biodiversity in general. And it's, in a way, it's global, but it's also very local as far as what's happening. One of the big problems around our area is that there was a program called the CRP, the Conservation Reserve Program, that would put land into, take land out of production. And we found that that is really critical, that land is really critical for bees. As crop prices rise, they're falling now a bit, but as crop prices rise and if there's not as much money to put into that program, then we see a big drop. We've seen a big drop in that. The other thing is that in agriculture, that there's been a trend towards really clean agriculture, where many of the weeds are in fact totally removed, and you can't blame those of us who are gardeners can't blame farmers for that. But what ends up happening is that loss of those weeds ends up really losing. You lose a lot of food as well for the bees. So those are some things that's locally been happening quite a bit. Yeah. I'm ready for more.
You say there's a new building at the U.
Yeah.
Is that open to the public for learning? Or
Yeah, so the new building at the university, if you get on the website, there are tours every now and then, but it's a research facility. The Arboretum, it has a new bee center that was just built in, is August, I think. So that's a brand new bee center, maybe some of you have been there. And that's a great place to go for some of the learning stuff, but then we have stuff every now and then if you can't keep on the website. The website's a great place. Our website and the Bee Lab, the Bee Squad really does a lot of outreach events, and we have a ton of outreach events to look at too. But, yeah.
You mentioned just briefly the Africanized bees that were moving up through South America and then I think they maybe even got to Texas. And it just doesn't seem like it's a factor anymore. Can you?
Yeah, the Africanized bees thing. Yeah, I think that's, people have always been worried about that quite a while ago, and they're still around, but they just never moved up much past Texas. They sound really scary, and they are but you'd have to really be. You can outrun them, so people say you can't outrun them. You can't, honestly. I mean, you'd have to walk into a hive and really anger it. I mean, it's in South America, in Latin America, the beekeepers there, they keep Africanized bees. They're very healthy. They don't have disease problems. They actually prefer to keep Africanized bees throughout much of South America. But that bee's a really interesting. The Africanized bee, it's actually from Africa, and if you've seen shows on the honey badger. And that's why they're so aggressive. Honestly, they have such intense predation from things like the honey badger that they've evolved to be really, really, really aggressive. And so that's what those are. But they're really good pollinators, and they're not really causing the problems that people worried about. And they seem to not have any other northern range expansion. Yeah.
You mentioned that bees from 75 to 125 million years ago were just like the ones that were today. So has there been an evolution, or have they been able to figure out what happened, say, 300 million years ago?
So about 300 million years ago, the Hymenoptera were first evolving. So those ants, bees, and wasps, something early on in that sort of way. But we do know about 65, 75 million years ago, we had what's called a radiation or an explosion. And that explosion happened over millions of years, a few million years, but that's when we got this really rapid diversification, and a lot of the families were kind of happened there. But since that time, there has been still evolution going on. But some things you might not recognize, the different. You might not, as a layperson. I mean, if I saw it, I'd freak out. But as they might not be that different from what a layperson would end up seeing.
Do they interbreed and?
The species?
Yeah, the species get mixed up after.
So that's a great question, and biologists fight vigorously about what a species actually is sometimes. But we don't know enough about some of the interbreeding in some of these. But the ones that we call species that we know of, we think are pretty genetically distinct and not. But that's actually a very hard question to answer. Yeah.
What impact is climate change having on bees?
What impact is? That's a great question. What's the impact of climate change on bees? we don't know yet. One of the concerns has been that there's going to be a mismatch, especially we're worried about some of the early spring bees, so that some flowers might come out earlier, or the bees might not be matched up, especially in the spring when there's not a lot of food resources. And on a general aspect, we haven't seen a huge problem with that yet, although there has been some specific cases where you've got some of this mismatches going on. Another thing that's happened, and we're not really sure what's going on, but we've seen, there's some evidence to suggest that at least in bumblebees, the bumblebees are being pushed northward. The southern bumblebees are being pushed northward, but there seems to be a barrier or something, and the northern bumblebees aren't being pushed northward. So there's kind of seeming to these southern bees are being pushed up, and that could lead to some competition or other sorts of things. So we're seeing some potential problems, but we're not sure not sure yet totally. Yeah. Great question. All right. Thanks, you guys. Fun.
And just so everybody knows, we have some really